For in the same way, the holy women who hoped in God long ago adorned themselves by being subject to their husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You become her children when you do what is good and have no fear in doing so. Thus Peter, in 1 Peter 3, 5 and 6, commends for Christian wives the example of Sarah, recognizing her as a holy woman of old, and even saying that if the Christian women maintained faith like Sarah did, they would be reckoned as her children. It's interesting that Peter would make reference thus to Sarah and to use her as an example, although it is also very understandable. Sarah is the wife of Abraham. Abraham we hail as the father of the faith, father of promise, because he was the one to trust in God, and to him the promises were made that would extend all the way and be fully manifest in Jesus. We do well to consider the story in Genesis 11 through 28, the story that we normally use and focus on Abraham, to also now consider how it tells of the story of Sarah and what we can learn about Sarah and her example of faith as we consider again the cloud of witnesses and what we can gain from the insights into their character. Sarah, in Genesis 11, is identified as the wife of Abraham. We're going to speak of Abraham and Sarah, even though that is the name God will give them later. They're Abraham and Sarah at the beginning. We're, for the consistency, going to call them Abraham and Sarah. We will be told in the story that she is, in fact, a half-sister of Abraham, that they are both children of Terah, although they have different mothers. Terah, in Joshua 24, is reckoned and confessed as an idolater. For the majority of the life, 65 years it seems of Sarah's life, when she was living in Ur and then Haran with her father and also her brother husband, was probably an idolater too. We believe that this is going on around the time of the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Somewhere around the year 2000 BC, if you follow the biblical chronology as laid out in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. And the archaeological evidence would collaborate with this, because a lot of the customs that Sarah and Abraham are manifesting are things that have been foreign to Moses 500 years later, let alone to David another 500 years after that, or even later times. We'll see that as we continue in our story. This is a time of great transition. There's been a major change in the climate at this time. The lands of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant have gotten drier and are going to be continually getting dried out, and that is going to significantly affect people, and it's going to lead to a lot of migration, which is, of course, the story that we see inherent in the days of Abraham and Sarah, who are reckoned as Arameans from Ur, the most cosmopolitan city of the day, going to a little bit less civilized, quote-unquote, area in Haran, in the land of the Arameans, and being reckoned as Arameans. And then, of course, God calls Abraham to go to Canaan. And what's interesting when we look at all of these stories about Abraham is that we can see that in these stories, Sarah ends up having a greater faith than Abraham. Because think about all of the major episodes that go on in Abraham's life. Abraham comes home one day and says, Sarah, I heard a voice, and the voice told me I should go to Canaan. If I do that, he's going to bless me, and I'm going to have all kinds of descendants. How would you feel if somebody came home and told you that? Sarah had not heard of this God, but her husband trusted in him, so she would trust in him, and she would go. When they get to the land, all kinds of decisions were made. Lot was given the better land. How did Sarah feel about that? When Abraham went to try to rescue Lot from all these Mesopotamian kings, how did Sarah feel about that? Then we hear that Abraham, was going to be blessed by God. And Sarah heard about this from Genesis chapter 15, that Abraham would have an heir. And so, because she recognized she was no longer going to be able to bear children, she then gives Hagar, her Egyptian slave, as a proxy wife, so that Abraham can have children, so that there may be those descendants that would be innumerable that would come through Abraham. It did not go well for Sarah. Sarah then was bitterly resentful about this and jealous about this for the rest of the time and would chastise Abraham about these things. However, it is Sarah who is the one who offers up Hagar, which is according to the custom of the time. In the Mesopotamian world, a woman like Sarah is in a precarious predicament because she has not borne sons to Abraham. He would have the right to put her away. But provision was made to provide a proxy wife, like what Sarah does with Hagar, so that the children born through the proxy wife would be reckoned as the wife of the children of the one who is infertile, and therefore continuing on that lineage. In that story, it's very interesting that twice Sarah will speak of Yahweh. That Yahweh has caused me to be childless, and may Yahweh judge between you and me, speaking to Abraham about the whole Hagar affair. That in this time, Sarah now identifies with Yahweh as her God, because it is the God of her husband, the God that they have followed into this time where they are now in tents, living without any kind of stability, like most of us have come to know and to appreciate. We know the way that Sarah feels when God returns and affirms a covenant with Abraham, and about 13 years later, because when the guests come and speak of the fact that within a year Sarah would be holding a son, she laughs and thinks the whole thing is funny. And we'll have much more to say about that in a little bit. But then she has that son. She's very protective of that son. So we can only imagine what she would have thought about hearing that Abraham had taken the child in the Akedah in chapter 22 of Genesis to go offer him to God as a burnt offering on a mountain that God had chosen. We don't know if she ever heard about it. She probably at some point found out about it. We can only imagine the way that she would have felt about such things. The Hebrews author will include Sarah in the commendations of these people of old who lived in tents, and they were looking for the heavenly city whose founder and builder is God. And it is true that Sarah has this great faith because we see that she has one direct involvement with God. Again, we'll have a lot to talk about when it comes to that engagement. But overall, she does not have the kind of constant communication with God in the way that Abraham does. And she yet follows. She yet trusts. She yet goes with him. She is a participant in these things. And whereas an Isaac or a Jacob would never have known anything different than living in tents, Sarah would remember living in Ur and in Haran, in a much more stable, settled way of life, and a way of life that she no longer had because of her husband's faith and a faith that she had made her own. So it's very understandable why Peter would have us look to Sarah as that example of faith. It's very interesting, however, that he would have us look to her as an example of being subjection to her husband, because the relationship between Abraham and Sarah is a very interesting one. And it's hard to not talk about, in terms of that relationship, the events that go on in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 20. It happens twice with Pharaoh and Abimelech. In both circumstances, Abraham has been concerned because of the beauty of Sarah. And at this point, remember, Sarah is 65. Is 99, or 89, she's extremely beautiful, right? And because of that, he's convinced that the people then are going to kill him. And so he has her have this demonstration of loyalty, as he will put it in Genesis chapter 20, that wherever we have sojourned, I've asked her to show this loyalty to me, that wherever we go, you will say, he is my brother. That they're relying on the fact that, yes, she is technically his half-sister, and that is how they've been passing off that, not totally being honest with thee, but he's also my husband bit. There's a lot to talk about the fact that they are half-siblings who are married. That's a completely different conversation. But when we talk about what's going on in Genesis 12 and 20, normally we talk about in terms of Abraham doesn't have enough faith in the people around him. Abraham has become guilty of something here. Abraham is the one held fully responsible. Also, by the way, Sarah is never held responsible for having made this decision. This is something that falls squarely on Abraham's shoulders in terms of the responsibility. But all the consequences of it have fallen on Sarah. Because what does it mean? What does it mean? Something they would ostensibly understand, and Sarah would ostensibly understand from even making or agreeing to that kind of thing. Was exactly what happened. She is taken by Pharaoh and Abimelech into their harems. as wives. It's interesting in chapter 20 that the text tells you over and over, the Genesis author wants you to be very clear, Abraham did not have relations with Sarah. Abimelech did not have relations with Sarah. Wants to make that extremely clear because within the next chapter, we're going to find out that Isaac is born. All of a sudden, now Sarah is able to conceive after all this time, after she was in Abimelech's house for a while. You can understand why there's a strong emphasis here that God made sure that he did not touch her, and that there would be no sin on his part, and the whole thing was exposed. That statement is noticeably absent in Genesis 12 about Pharaoh, which leads us to the very credible interpretation, and probably the more likely interpretation, that in fact Pharaoh did have relations with Sarah as a wife, because he was doing that under the pretenses that was established. And that was the cost that would come to this. That Abraham was putting his wife in this position in his attempt to save his own neck. And she was willing to go along with it and bear that cost, and then be the woman being passed around to these men because of her beauty, in fear that they were going to kill her husband brother. That's the cost of what it cost Sarah in order to be faithful to her husband and to be obedient to her husband. And she is the one who goes and does these things. The one issue that we've talked about, right, that she has this faith, another way we can look at it is, what choice does she really have? Abraham says, I've heard this voice, I'm going. What's she going to do? She's going to follow. When all these things take place, what's she going to do? She is in a very precarious position herself. And when we see, especially with that episode with Hagar, we see her trying to involve herself in the situation, but the fact that at two situations, that Sarah goes after Abraham about Hagar, in chapter 16 and in chapter 21, Abraham affirms that Hagar is a slave wife, not a full wife, and therefore still the slave of Sarah and under Sarah's power. And even when he doesn't want to kick them out, God says you should listen to your wife, and kicks them out. In both situations, Sarah has a lot of agency, and Abraham is willing to concede and willing to listen. And that is a significant part of the dynamic in their relationship. Not trying to suggest Abraham and Sarah don't have some kind of loving relationship. Not necessarily see all the details of that relationship. They certainly seem to. And yes, she certainly does call him Lord, as we're going to see in Genesis 18. And she certainly has proven obedient, even in shocking situations where today we would have a lot of qualms with expecting obedience in those circumstances. But she is not a doormat. She will have issues with her husband, and her husband will have to listen to her. And that's also something important to keep in mind when we consider her example in faith and as under subjection to her husband. But what makes Peter's reference really funny is that Sarah calls Abraham Lord in Genesis chapter 18, after there have been 3 guests who have arrived. And Abraham is trying to show hospitality to these guests. And the tent where Sarah is dwelling is right next to it. And Abraham is asked where Sarah is, and she's in the tent. She can hear all of this. And Abraham is told that she will be, at this time next year, she will be holding a son. That the conception and the birth will have happened by then. And Sarah hears this. And in verse 12, she laughs to herself, thinking, after I am worn out will I have pleasure, especially when my husband, my Lord, is old too. It's a statement where here is the only recorded time that Sarah is in the presence of God. And by the way, the only other person to be in the presence of God in this same way is Eve. In the whole of Genesis, and one of the very few times where a woman is pretty much right in the face and presence of God, and she laughs. Now, why is she laughing? We could say she's laughing a little bit just in incredulity of even the concept of it. There might be some bitterness in it. She is a 89-year-old woman married to a 99-year-old man who has had to come to grips with the fact that she is barren. And it can be a hurtful thing to bring that up and to provide this kind of hope if that hope was not going to be fulfilled. And so maybe that's what's going on. But when we read the surface of the text, after I am worn out, will I have pleasure when my Lord is old also? Maybe she's just laughing at the prospect of sexual relations again. And she looks at herself as somebody worn out with the sexual relations they've had throughout all the years. And to suggest that she would have pleasure again just seems funny to her. And that we can totally understand that. But she's laughing in God's presence. And then the guest asks Abraham, why did your Sarah laugh? Am I not able to? Is not anything impossible for the Lord? And Sarah then lied, saying, I didn't laugh. Now, she probably maybe laughed in her head and thought these things in her head and try to cover it up, lied, say, I didn't laugh. No, you did laugh. Now, this seems impious. Sarah's in the presence of God. She laughs. Then lies when she's called out about her laughing. How is this the example of faith? Well, again, she may not have realized it was Yahweh until all of a sudden she realizes this guest has to be more than just a guest, because how could he have known what she was thinking? Maybe that's part of that thing. But also part of it is that she laughs, but God's going to get the last laugh. Because when we go to chapter 21, and when Isaac is born, Sarah said in verse 6, God has made me laugh. Everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. God will make me laugh. And that laugh is memorialized in the name of her son. She laughs. Yitzhak. We call him Isaac. That laugh is memorialized. That, yeah, Sarah laughed at the prospect, but God had the final laugh because, as Paul says in Romans 4, God is a God who can bring life where there had been death. Sarah's womb had been barren. In this miraculous way, she was able to give birth to a son in her old age. The vindication. Sarah has been put through the ringer. Sarah has gone through a lot that she's been put through by Abraham and by the God of Abraham. But yet now she laughs. And she can laugh with vindication because God has made her laugh. Because she has a son in her old age, the son of promise, which is why she is reckoned as the mother of the faithful, because she is the mother of the promised child, the child of promise, whose descendants would inherit the promises manifest in Israel and ultimately through Jesus Christ. And that is why we honor Sarah, but recognize what it took for Sarah to get there. And that is why maybe Peter is right to quote Genesis 18 and verse 12, to leave us with that memory of Sarah laughing. Laughing in incredulity because of all she suffered and this prospect given to her, and then laughing in that vindication. That's the kind of God we serve, who can do things like that. That's the kind of God that Sarah served, and that was the vindication of Sarah, and the vindication that we can have as well if we put our trust in him. We're again so glad that you've joined us. If you have any questions, comments, please let us know. If we can be of any service to you, please let us know at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. And may the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.